The morning Francesca Harrington agreed to marry Virgil Cobb, her hands would not stop shaking. They were not shaking from happiness. They were not even shaking from nerves. They were shaking because of something her oldest friend had told her the night before. The words had settled inside her chest and refused to leave. Darlene Hobbs had grabbed both of Francesca's shoulders and looked at her with a seriousness that made the room feel smaller. "He doesn't love you, Franny," Darlene had said quietly. "He's marrying you to settle a score with your father." Those words stayed with Francesca through the entire night and followed her into the next morning like a shadow. They sat heavy in her chest while she dressed. They sat there while she pinned her hair in front of the mirror. They stayed with her when she stood by the upstairs window and looked down into the ranch yard. Virgil Cobb was standing below with his hat in his hands. He was speaking with her father in a calm, steady voice. From where she stood, he looked patient and quiet. There was nothing about him that looked like a man carrying revenge in his pocket. But Francesca had lived long enough to know something about men. The most dangerous ones were often the calmest. Francesca was 24 years old. She was the only daughter of Gerald Harrington, the man who owned the largest cattle ranch in Cutter's Bend, Colorado. The Harrington Ranch stretched across miles of land, rolling pastures and strong wooden fences that her father had built piece by piece over many years. Gerald Harrington was not a gentle man. He had built his fortune through hard decisions and deals that were not always fair. People in town respected him. They tipped their hats when he passed. But respect was not the same as liking someone. Francesca had grown up seeing the difference. She had watched men smile at her father in public and complain about him quietly behind closed doors. She had learned early that success often came with enemies. Virgil Cobb had arrived in Cutter's Bend 3 years earlier. When he first rode into town, he had almost nothing with him. A bedroll tied behind his saddle, a single horse, and a reputation that traveled ahead of him. People said he was one of the best ranch hands in the territory, a man who could mend a broken fence faster than anyone and manage land like he had been born on it. Her father had hired him within a week. That part had not surprised anyone. Gerald Harrington had a sharp eye for useful men. But what happened afterward had surprised the entire town. Within a year, Virgil was managing the South pastures. Within 2 years, her father trusted him with the ranch books and cattle numbers. And now, after 3 years in Cutter's Bend, Virgil Cobb had asked to marry Gerald Harrington's daughter. The town had opinions about that. Cutter's Bend always did. The woman at the dry goods store told anyone who would listen that men who rose that quickly always wanted something. "Men like him don't climb that fast without a reason," she said more than once. What people did not say out loud was something even heavier. Virgil Cobb once had a younger brother, and years before Virgil arrived in Cutter's Bend, that younger brother had borrowed money from Gerald Harrington. The story after that was unclear. Like most small-town stories, it had changed shape over time. But the pieces were familiar enough to make people whisper. A young man had taken a loan. The loan had gone badly, and the Harrington Ranch had ended up owning land that once belonged to the Cobb family. Francesca knew some of this story, not all of it. Her father had never explained his business dealings in detail, and Francesca had never pushed hard enough to find out. Maybe part of her had not wanted to know. But Darlene Hobbs knew every rumor in Cutter's Bend before it finished forming. And the night before the engagement dinner, she had connected the pieces in a way Francesca could not ignore. "Your father ruined his brother Franny," Darlene had said. "And now Virgil Cobb is about to own half of everything your father built. You think that's a coincidence?" The words had been impossible to forget. The truth was that Francesca had noticed Virgil long before the engagement happened. She had noticed him in quiet moments the way you notice something that feels slightly different from everything around it. Virgil was not loud like most of the ranch hands. He did not brag about his work or try to impress people. He worked hard without complaining and rested when he needed to without apologizing for it. He spoke in fewer words than most men, and he had a habit that had always stayed in her mind. Whenever someone else spoke, Virgil became completely still. Not impatient, not distracted, just still, as if he was actually listening. Francesca had spoken to him only a handful of times, once during a winter supper when her father invited the ranch hands inside during a storm, once by the water pump when she needed help lifting a bucket. A few brief moments in passing. Virgil had never acted bold with her. He had never hovered close the way some men did, and he had never looked at her the way other men sometimes did, like she was something valuable that belonged to her father. That had always puzzled her. But now Darlene's warning made everything feel different. Maybe Virgil's distance had not been respect. Maybe it had been strategy. That evening, Virgil joined them for supper, as he often did since the engagement was announced. Gerald Harrington sat at the head of the table, cutting his meat with the confidence of a man who believed he had arranged something favorable. Francesca sat across from Virgil and tried to focus on her food. Every now and then she glanced up at him. Virgil Cobb was 31 years old. He was lean from years of working outdoors. His dark hair already carried faint threads of gray at the temples. His face was not the kind that people called handsome, but it carried a quiet steadiness that made other men seem restless by comparison. His hands rested calmly beside his plate when he was not using them. No tapping, no fidgeting, just stillness. At one moment he looked up and caught her watching him. Francesca quickly looked down at her plate. "The north fence line held through the storm," Virgil said calmly to her father. Gerald nodded. "Knew it would. You reinforced it right." Francesca stayed quiet, but she felt something shift in the air around them. She could not decide what troubled her more, the possibility that Virgil had seen her watching him and ignored it, or the possibility that he simply had nothing to hide. After supper, her father stepped outside to smoke his usual cigar, leaving Francesca alone in the kitchen with the dishes. Virgil stood and began gathering plates. "You don't have to do that," Francesca said. "I know," he replied simply. He carried 2 plates to the basin. They worked quietly for a few minutes. The kitchen was warm and smelled faintly of bread and coffee. Outside, the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting the dusty yard with deep copper light. Francesca dried one of the plates slowly. "Can I ask you something?" she said suddenly. Virgil set another plate down beside the basin and looked at her. "You can." The answer was simple, honest. Francesca hesitated. She had planned to ask him directly. Why her? Why now? Was this marriage part of something he had planned for years? But something in his calm expression stopped her. Not fear. Something else. "Never mind," she said quietly. "It can wait." Virgil nodded slowly, as if he understood that she had pulled something back. He dried his hands on the cloth by the sink. "Good night, Miss Harrington." He walked out through the back door and down the wooden steps. Francesca stood alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to the sound of his boots fading into the yard. Whatever she had expected from Virgil Cobb, it had not been that. 2 days later, Francesca found Darlene behind the milliner shop, where she often helped with sewing work. The moment Darlene saw her face, she set down the fabric she was holding. "Tell me everything you know," Francesca said. "Not rumors, the truth." Darlene took a slow breath. "You sure you want it?" "I'm about to marry him," Francesca said. Darlene nodded. "Virgil had a younger brother named Walter," she said. "About 8 years ago, Walter came to your father asking for a loan to buy land east of the ridge." Francesca listened quietly. "Your father gave him the money," Darlene continued. But the loan terms were steep. Walter couldn't keep up with the payments. Your father called the debt early and took the land." "What happened to Walter?" Francesca asked. "No one knows exactly," Darlene said. "Some say he went north. Some say he never made it far." Francesca felt a chill settle inside her. "And then Virgil came here," she said slowly. "Yes," Darlene said. "And he came with purpose." Francesca walked home slowly that afternoon, along the quiet creek behind the south pasture. The water was low and clear between pale stones. She sat on a flat rock and tried to think carefully. Virgil had come to town after his brother lost everything to her father. He had slowly worked his way into Gerald Harrington's trust, and now he was marrying into the family. The story looked like a plan. But one memory kept returning to her mind. 2 years earlier, her horse had stumbled while she was riding alone. She had fallen hard into the dry grass beside the trail. Before she could even stand up, Virgil had appeared from the nearby fence line. He had checked the horse quietly and helped her without making a fuss, but she remembered the look he gave her. It had not been cold. It had not been calculating. It had been something else. Something she still could not name. The wedding was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to watch. 6 weeks to learn the truth. Because Francesca Harrington needed to know one thing before she stood beside Virgil Cobb at the altar. Was she marrying a man who secretly loved her? Or was she walking directly into someone else's revenge plan? That night, Francesca lay awake in her room long after the ranch had gone quiet. The window beside her bed was open, and the cool Colorado air drifted inside, carrying the faint smell of hay and horses from the barns. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. Darlene's warning still echoed in her mind. He's marrying you to settle a score. But the more she replayed her memories of Virgil Cobb, the harder it became to fit that idea around the man she had seen these past 3 years. She remembered the way his hands went completely still whenever someone spoke to him. She remembered the quiet patience in his voice. She remembered the way he had picked up the dinner plates without being asked. None of those things felt like the actions of a man planning revenge, and yet the story about his brother would not leave her mind either. Walter Cobb, alone. Lost land, a family broken by her father's business. Somewhere in that history was the truth about Virgil, and Francesca realized that if she was going to marry this man, she had the right to know it. The next morning, she did something she had never done before. She went to the ranch records room. Gerald Harrington kept every business document inside a tall cedar cabinet beside his desk. Ledgers, loan agreements, land deeds, and letters from the past 15 years were all locked inside it. Francesca had never touched those records before. Her father's business was something she had always kept her distance from. But that morning felt different. In 6 weeks, she would be married. And if the Harrington Ranch was about to become her future, she believed she had the right to understand its past. Her father had already ridden out at sunrise to inspect a problem at the north well. That meant she had at least 2 hours before he returned. The cabinet was locked, but she knew where the key was hidden. Her father had shown her once years ago in case of an emergency. She was not sure this counted as one. Still, she went to retrieve it. It took her nearly 20 minutes to find the correct ledger. When she finally did, she opened it slowly and began flipping through the pages until she found the entry she was looking for. Walter Cobb. The loan was recorded in neat black ink. Her father's handwriting was clean and organized as always. Francesca read the agreement once. Then she read it again. By the second reading, her jaw had tightened. The interest rate was far higher than any fair lender would have offered. The repayment schedule was short enough that even an experienced rancher would have struggled to meet it. And near the bottom of the contract, There was a clause written in smaller lettering. It allowed Gerald Harrington to demand the full repayment of the loan at any time if he believed the borrower might fail to complete the payments. Francesca stared at that line for a long moment. Her father had used that clause 14 months after the loan was given. Walter Cobb had never truly been given a chance. The loan had been designed to fail. Francesca leaned back in her father's chair and looked up at the ceiling. She had always known her father was a hard businessman, but this was something colder, something deliberate. After a few moments, she carefully closed the ledger and placed it back exactly where she had found it. She locked the cabinet again and returned the key to its hiding place. Then she stepped outside into the bright morning air and took a slow breath. The sky was clear and pale blue above the ranch. Francesca stood there for a minute, gathering her thoughts. Then she walked toward the south barn. She found Virgil near the water trough, repairing a loose hinge on one of the pasture gates. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and a small pile of tools rested beside him in the dust. When he heard her footsteps, he looked up. He set his tools aside immediately and wiped his hands on a cloth. Francesca did not waste time. "I read the loan agreement between my father and your brother," she said. Something shifted in Virgil's face. It was not surprise. It looked more like a door slowly opening. "When?" he asked. "This morning." Virgil was quiet for a moment. He wiped his hands again, as if giving himself time to think. Then he looked directly at her. "What did you want to know?" Francesca crossed her arms lightly. "Whether Darlene Hobbs was right," she said. "Whether this job, this trust you built with my father, and this engagement were all part of settling something with him." The wind moved softly across the ranch yard. A horse stamped somewhere behind the barn. Virgil studied her face for a long moment. Not defensive, not angry, just thinking. "When I came here," he said slowly, "I was angry." Francesca waited. "That part is true," he continued. "Walter lost everything. It broke him, and I needed someone to blame. Your father was an easy man to blame." "So you came here to take something back," she said. Virgil shook his head slightly. "I came here to understand how a man like your father worked. I told myself that was all it was." He paused for a moment. "I stayed because of the work." Francesca looked at him carefully. "And then?" Virgil glanced down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "And then I saw you fall off your horse one afternoon." Francesca blinked in surprise. He continued calmly. "You got thrown hard. Most people would have made a scene about it. You stood up, brushed the dust off your coat, and climbed right back on the horse." His voice remained steady. "I went home that evening and realized something strange had happened." "What?" she asked quietly. "I wasn't angry anymore." The words landed softly between them. Francesca felt something warm and confusing settle in her chest. "That was almost 2 years ago," she said. "Yes. You never said anything." Virgil gave a small shrug. "You were Gerald Harrington's daughter," he said, "and I was a ranch hand who had every reason in the world to dislike your family." He looked at her calmly. "What exactly was I supposed to say?" Francesca had no answer. The days that followed felt different, not completely settled, but something had shifted. Francesca stopped watching Virgil for signs of revenge. Instead, she began watching him the way she probably should have from the beginning. She noticed small things she had ignored before. The way he quietly gave the easier tasks to the older ranch hands. The way he remembered details people mentioned once in passing and followed up later. A sick mother, a broken roof, a horse that needed rest. He rarely spoke about those things, but he always acted on them. She watched the way he handled her father's temper with calm patience. Gerald Harrington was not an easy man to work for. But Virgil never argued loudly. He simply waited until her father finished speaking, and then answered in his steady voice. Virgil was not perfect. He had a temper he kept tightly controlled. There were mornings when he seemed distant and quiet, and he was a private man who did not explain himself easily. But he was not cruel. He was not calculating. And every time Francesca tested that idea, it held true. Darlene visited one afternoon while Francesca was watering the small garden behind the house. "You look happier than I expected," Darlene said, watching her carefully. Francesca smiled faintly. "I think I misjudged him." "You trust him now?" Darlene asked. Francesca thought about it for a moment. "I'm starting to." Darlene folded her arms. "Just be careful." "I will," Francesca said calmly. "But being careful doesn't mean assuming the worst about someone." 6 weeks passed faster than Francesca expected. Soon, the morning of the wedding arrived. It was a clear October day, with a sharp chill in the air, and the mountains standing tall against the sky beyond the ranch fields. The ceremony was simple. A small group of ranch hands and townspeople gathered in the yard beside the house. A long wooden table had been prepared for food afterward. Francesca stood beside Virgil while the preacher spoke the vows. When Virgil repeated his promise, his voice was steady and calm. His hands were still, just like they always were. After the ceremony, the guests moved toward the long table, and the sound of quiet conversation filled the yard. Virgil found Francesca standing alone near the fence for a moment. "I want you to know something," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I came here angry," he said. "That part was true, but I never used you, not once." His voice was serious. "I need you to know that." Francesca held his gaze. "I know," she said. Virgil looked surprised. "How?" Francesca smiled slightly. "I've been watching you for weeks, Virgil Cobb." She tilted her head a little. "You're not as hard to read as you think." For the first time since she had known him, something close to a smile appeared on his face. The conversation with her father came 3 weeks after the wedding. Francesca had waited for the right moment. Gerald Harrington was not a man who listened well when he felt cornered. He listened best when things were calm and the ranch was running smoothly. That quiet moment came on a Sunday afternoon. The sky was clear, and the wind moved gently through the pasture grass. Most of the ranch hands had taken the afternoon off. The barns were quiet, and the cattle had drifted toward the far fields. Gerald sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of him. Francesca took the chair across from him. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him of anything. Instead, she spoke calmly. "I looked through the ranch ledgers last week," she said. Her father's eyes lifted slowly. "That's so?" "Yes," she replied. She placed both hands on the table and met his gaze directly. "I read the loan agreement you made with Walter Cobb." The room grew very quiet. Gerald did not answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair and studied his daughter carefully. "What about it?" he asked after a moment. Francesca spoke plainly. The terms were impossible. Her father said nothing. "The interest was far too high," she continued, "and the clause allowing you to call the loan early made it certain he would lose the land." Still, her father remained silent. Francesca did not look away. "You designed that loan to fail." The silence stretched across the room. Gerald Harrington was not a man who admitted mistakes easily. Pride had built most of what he owned. But beneath that pride was another trait. He respected honesty. And Francesca had always been honest with him. "The boy wasn't careful," Gerald said finally. "He was 22 years old," Francesca replied. Her father's jaw tightened slightly. "You knew exactly what you were doing." He did not argue with her. That silence said more than any explanation could. After a moment, Gerald looked at her again. "Is this about your husband?" he asked. Francesca shook her head. "This is about what's right." She paused before adding something important. "Virgil never asked me to have this conversation." Her father frowned slightly. "He doesn't even know I'm sitting here right now." That detail seemed to affect Gerald more than anything else she had said. For the first time, his eyes dropped to the table. Gerald Harrington did not change overnight. A lifetime of hard choices had shaped the man he had become. But he was not entirely without conscience, and his daughter's calm honesty reached places that anger never could. Several weeks later, he contacted a man in Denver who specialized in locating people who had moved away from the territory. It took time. Nearly a month passed before they received news. Walter Cobb was alive. He had settled in a small community north of the territory line. He worked as a carpenter and lived quietly, keeping mostly to himself. Gerald Harrington wrote him a letter. It was not long. It did not contain fancy words or excuses. The letter simply explained what had happened and made an offer. Gerald offered Walter a portion of land east of the ridge. It was the same land Walter had once tried to buy. The land had remained unused for years after the Harrington Ranch absorbed it. Walter did not respond immediately. 6 weeks passed with no answer. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. Virgil was sitting at the breakfast table when Francesca handed it to him. He looked at the envelope with confusion before opening it. Francesca watched his expression carefully as he read. He read the letter once, then he read it again. Finally, he placed it slowly on the table. "Your father did this?" he asked quietly. Francesca nodded. "With a conversation I started." Virgil looked at her for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the morning sun lit the fields with pale gold light. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Francesca replied gently, "but it was the right thing to do." Virgil sat silently for a moment. Then he spoke in a voice softer than usual. "I came to Cutter's Bend with a stone in my chest." Francesca listened quietly. "I carried that anger for so long, I stopped remembering what it felt like not to." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Maybe you can set it down now," she said. Virgil turned his hand and held hers. "Maybe I can," he said quietly. Walter Cobb arrived in November. The first snow of the season had dusted the upper mountain ridges, and the ranch had begun slowing into its winter rhythm. Francesca stood by the kitchen window that morning when Walter rode into the yard. He looked similar to Virgil in some ways. He had the same calm stillness in his movements, but his face carried the wear of years spent alone. Virgil walked out to meet him. The two brothers stood in the cold yard for a long time without speaking loudly. Francesca could not hear their words from the window. She did not need to. Some things did not require explanation. The years between them slowly began to close. Walter stayed on the ranch for 2 days while he examined the land her father had offered. He walked the fields alone. He studied the soil. He followed the creek that crossed the property. On the 3rd morning, he returned to the house. Gerald Harrington stood beside the fence waiting for him. Walter spoke only a few words. "I'll take the land." Gerald nodded once and shook his hand. It was not a warm moment, but it was an honest one. Sometimes that was enough. By the following spring, Walter had built a small cabin on the land east of the ridge. He worked the fields slowly and carefully, rebuilding the life that had once slipped away from him. Every Sunday he came to supper at Virgil and Francesca's house. Walter did not talk much, but he always stayed late. And slowly the quiet between the three of them stopped feeling uncomfortable. It began to feel peaceful. Francesca often watched Virgil during those evenings. The anger he once carried had softened. The stone he had spoken about was not completely gone. Some things never disappear entirely, but it no longer weighed on him the same way. He laughed more easily now. He sat at the table with a kind of calm that came from knowing exactly where he belonged. Darlene visited one afternoon in early spring, when the trees along the creek were finally turning green again. She studied Francesca with a thoughtful expression. "Well," she said after a moment, "I was wrong about him." Francesca smiled slightly. "You were working with incomplete information." Darlene shook her head. "No, I was wrong." She looked out toward the pasture where Virgil was repairing a fence. "He's a good man." Francesca nodded. "He's a complicated man." Darlene grinned. "The complicated ones usually are." Life in Cutter's Bend slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. People in town never completely stopped talking about Virgil Cobb. Small towns rarely stopped talking about anything. But over time, the shape of the story changed. People saw how Virgil ran the ranch with fairness and steady judgment. They saw the way he treated Francesca with quiet respect rather than grand displays. They saw Walter Cobb building a new life on the land east of the ridge. And little by little, the old rumors faded. The revenge story people once whispered began to feel like what it had always been. A guess. A story created by people looking at the outside of things and filling the empty spaces with what seemed most likely. But the truth had always been simpler. Virgil Cobb had come to Cutter's Bend carrying anger. That part had been real. But somewhere along the way, something stronger had replaced it. A quiet respect, a steady loyalty, and a love that had begun the afternoon he watched a stubborn young woman climb back onto her horse after a hard fall. The town eventually understood that. They tipped their hats to Virgil Cobb when he passed on the street, and this time they meant it.